And thank you to Dan and Leslie and the organizing, all the organizers for inviting me to do this paper. But when it came time to me to actually write it, nearly 2 years after giving a title, I was really struggling to remember what exactly I was thinking. But I ended up coming across this article published just last year and started thinking about how it applied to cotton evidence. So this is still something of a working paper. But this article was focused on a single theory of widespread agricultural change affecting the Middle East and Mediterranean in the early medieval period, but through the lens of a single crop. And the authors noted that while the historical sources used to underpin this theory had received much attention by historians, there had been little engagement with the archaeological and in particular archaeobotanical evidence. And the theory itself will be well known to many. In 1974 and again in 1983, Andrew Watson proposed what would become one of the more enduring theories of widespread social and economic change in the first millennium, a dramatic change in agricultural practices that spread with the expansion of Islam. And this has been variously termed the Islamic agricultural revolution or the medieval green revolution, but it's constructed as affecting really the entire Middle East and Mediterranean region. It was predicated on an influx of new summer crops introduced by Arab traders from the East and Indian subcontinent, the adaptation and revival of agricultural technologies, particularly irrigation systems, and changes to land tenure policies which enabled these changes. The ensuing surplus formation and urbanization, Watson said, impacted economic structures such as labor, production, demography, and ultimately medieval social and economic organization. Of the numerous crops that Watson selected to highlight, only one, cotton, was a non-foodstuff. And Watson singled cotton out as being particularly important for this reason. If you're growing cotton, you presumably have enough to eat. Watson's assertion that political transformation and unification of exchange networks were responsible for widespread agricultural change, resulting in societal transformation, proved highly influential. And there have been several sustained critiques of Watson's theory. First, the introduction and reinvigoration of irrigation technologies has been shown to be regionally dependent. There was already widespread diffusion of various water lifting technologies to aid irrigation by the Roman and Byzantine periods throughout Afro-Eurasia, such as the water wheel, the kanat, or the fogara, as it was known in North Africa, in which a channel is dug into a higher water table, enabling gravity to direct subterranean water to the surface, and also the human-powered shaduf wells. The latter two are shown here on the screen. By late antiquity, these technologies were already being used to bring marginal lands under cultivation throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And in 2009, Michael Decker looked specifically at 4 of the crops that Watson had highlighted as crucial during wheat, rice, artichoke, and cotton, showing that all were known and being cultivated at various locations around the Mediterranean prior to the spread of Islam, and that any structural change due to crop introduction would have been limited as a result. He showed that while the spread of Islam was important to agricultural change, Watson's argument regarding the overall societal impact was overstated. But despite this, the idea of an agricultural revolution still holds a lot of sway. When I started researching this, I was really struck by the number of times Watson remains uncritically cited, particularly for cotton, because it presents a linear narrative that fits well with how we think of cotton in later periods, as a global commodity that, for example, played a crucial role in the Industrial Revolution in Europe and in the rise of plantation agriculture in the American antebellum South, both the subject of recent histories. And there have been arguments that what Watson is really describing is intensification rather than innovation, crediting state policies and traders with extensive crop dissemination and the conscious effort to spread agricultural practices that allowed greater exploitation. And this is the context I started with because the difference between innovation and intensification is something addressed by Marika van der Veen, which shaped some of the conclusions I make at the end. So she argues that there are basically 2 types of innovation, macro inventions and micro inventions. That ultimately the question is, what is more important, the point of introduction, or the point when it becomes so embedded that it begins to have a wider impact on society. And what I'm leaning toward is that actually it's both, or perhaps neither, depending on how you look at it, because it's through the understanding of regional variation in the process of cotton agriculture that we can appreciate the regional variation in mechanisms of change as parts of long-term social processes. So I specifically focused on archaeobotanic evidence of cotton, seeds and agricultural byproduct, corresponding texts that indicated cultivation, and related systems of irrigation needed for a thirsty summer crop like cotton. I haven't included sites where only textiles were found, as those could, of course, be the result of trade. And also, with a few notable exceptions, most sites with extensive cotton textile finds are near sites of also known cultivation. And I also think this evidence, this shows evidence of limited trade and value of non-Indian cotton textiles, which also leads me to, I'm not going to be addressing cotton from India, because I think that's actually something entirely separate from what's being grown in kind of this area in the Middle East and Africa. So when we plot these cultivation sites on a map, this is the picture that we have, cotton cultivation prior to the spread of Islam. The earliest evidence we have in Africa comes from Nubia, approximately from the 1st century, although we know very little information about how it was actually being grown there. Excavations in much of Nubia have focused on rescue operations of sites along the Nile that have been threatened by dam construction. And at the site with the most evidence of cultivation, Qasr Ibrim, a large section of the ancient city and presumably the surrounding agricultural lands are under Lake Nasser. But we do see the gradual adoption of cotton cultivation in more marginal landscapes throughout Africa from this point, beginning with the Egyptian oases in the Western Desert, on the outskirts of the Roman world from the 2nd century, and the Fezzan in the Libyan desert, populated by the Gerontian culture from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And it's important to remember that this isn't actually the point of introduction. It's the first appearance of cotton in the archaeological record. But these are all oases located in the middle of the Sahara. Here you can see a satellite image of the Dakhla oasis. So you can see they require extensive irrigation networks to enable cultivation. And there are two things that are interesting about the oases of the Western Desert in particular. The first is that around the time we see cotton cultivation, there's also a really big population increase. And the second is that the two oases employ different irrigation systems, even though they're relatively near each other. In Karga, there's evidence of the use of qanats as well as wells, while in Dakhla, only wells have been uncovered. And this could be the result of how the oases were developed. Roger Bagnall has demonstrated that private investment was used to expand the irrigation networks in Dakhla and allowed for increased agriculture, which also included olive trees and date palms and things like that. It seems like this type of private development of marginal land might not have been uncommon. Similar private investment in irrigation networks to develop marginal land has been identified in Syria, Palestine, as sites such as in Drona, where inhabitants built an artificial oasis in the 6th century. The final site in Africa where there's evidence of cotton cultivation is at Axum, where seeds were found in several deposits dating from the 5th century to at least the 9th century, peaking in the late 7th. Irrigation systems imported from the Arabian Peninsula were long assumed to have been a key factor in the development of Axumite agriculture and society. But a recent survey of 84 sites revealed that actually communities were employing a variety of longstanding irrigation strategies to address local environmental concerns. Evidence of cotton cultivation can also be found in southern Syria and Western Arabia at Basra and Hegra. Cotton seeds were found alongside evidence of cultivation of a number of different plant species, including cereals, pulses, and fruit seeds from the 1st century. At Hegra, wells were used to provide the water required to feed the arid oasis, again, seen here from satellite image. In Basra, the system is more uncertain, but water collection and circulation systems have been found in the antique city and were possibly used to irrigate fields as well. Although both places were within the Roman Empire when cotton first appears, at least in Hegra, the Roman population was never very large. And the appearance of cotton cultivation has been interpreted to represent a local adoption rather than a practice imported by the Romans, and a desire by the local population to attempt the exploitation of a new non-food item. So there's additionally textual evidence of cotton in the Levant. The Mishnah, the 1st to 2nd century collection of oral traditions, refers to a wool vine growing in Palestine, repeated in both the 5th and 6th century Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. There's also a reference to cotton cultivation in Gregory of Tours, which I have here on the screen, from the 6th century. And while textile evidence shows that the use of cotton increased in this region throughout the Byzantine period, there's so far been no archaeological evidence of cotton cultivation itself. So this is still something of a question mark. And the so-called Nabatean agriculture, translated into Arabic in the 10th century from 5th to 6th century Syriac, also describes cotton cultivation in Iraq. Cotton cultivation may have additionally taken place at the ancient port of Isla on the north coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, and cotton seeds have been found here in deposits from the late Roman and Byzantine periods through the Islamic, along with cereals, but excavations have yet to identify field or irrigation systems. So that's right there. And then finally, cotton seeds have also been found in Merv, which was a bit surprising because this is much farther north than we find any other evidence of cultivation. They date from the middle to late Sasanian period, so roughly the 4th to 7th centuries, where its riverside location provided necessary irrigation. So what these sites show are that cotton cultivation was taking place in discrete locations in largely marginal settings with a variety of irrigation strategies dependent on the local populations and environments. So now we can turn to the period after the 7th century, and this is where I'm actually still in data collection. But Watson relied on later Arabic texts as evidence of widespread crop adoption and demand. He wrote that by the 10th century, cotton was being grown across the Middle East and Mediterranean. The evidence really suggests that it's not that extensive. For this period, the text of Arab geographers and historians suggest a wider distribution than we actually find in the archaeological record, and they sometimes contradict each other. So this is the picture that we get. Cotton cultivation seems to be more extensive in the Middle East, where we see greater connection between sites of cotton cultivation, but this really isn't seen elsewhere. So Richard Bulliet described how revival and expansion of irrigation systems by Yemeni immigrants into the Iranian plateau from the 8th century brought new land into cultivation to grow cotton, creating a boom that eventually died off in the 11th century due to the incursion of Turkic nomads and climatic cooling. Cotton seeds have also been found at sites in the Euphrates Valley, starting from the 8th or 9th century, confirming writers such as Ibn Hakal, who writes of its cultivation. And Syria is frequently referred to as a cotton exporter, along with the Maghreb. Vines increased dramatically, though, after the 12th century. There's also evidence of cotton cultivation expanding into Africa. So it's found at Qasr Ibrim and Jarma still. And there's evidence of local cultivation at Dia in the arid Middle Niger Valley from the 8th century, Volubilis in present-day Morocco in the 9th, and Assouk in Mali from the 11th century, and possibly at Ogo in the Middle Senegal Valley from the 11th century. That's based on pollen evidence. But at the moment, this is as far as the archaeology gets us. And I think there are a few reasons to approach the claims in text with caution. So I'll finish by offering a few examples. So in the 10th century, Ibn Hakal included Egypt as a cultivator of cotton, but there are very few references to cotton in the Egyptian sources, and even less evidence in the archaeology. By this point, the oases have been largely depopulated, and there's little evidence of cotton cultivation still occurring there. Two papyri refer specifically to cotton cultivation in the Nile Valley, one from the 9th or 10th century, which mentions cotton fields, and another refers to the purchase of seeds at Kos in Upper Egypt near Aswan, likely dating to the 11th century or perhaps later. We don't have firm dating for either of the two. Even in the 13th century, the Ayyubid official al-Nablusi recorded that in the Fayum, the few villages that had once cultivated cotton had abandoned it in favor of sugar. So even if it was being grown, it seems like this was very short-lived. And there have been no significant archaeological finds of cotton cultivation taking place anywhere in Egypt at this time. The majority of cotton textiles finds are very clearly imports. The Cairo Geniza, with its vast collection of commercial documents, does show cotton was an occasional import into Egypt from Syria and the Maghreb. And in one 11th century document from the Balad al-Rum, which Goitin proposed as Sicily. But interestingly, these sources also indicate that cotton was not particularly sought after. The few Arabic papyri from Egypt that I have found discussing cotton and in the Geniza, it's frequently associated with peasants or orphans, and it's being used for undergarments and trimmings of garments made from finer linens and silk. This actually matches not only the late Roman evidence of local cotton use, where it's referred to in papyri as being used to clothe field laborers, and cotton's rarely found in finer luxury fabrics. So the evidence suggests that cotton had very little presence in Egypt at this time. And incidentally, this is also how cotton is spoken of in the few Byzantine sources that mention it, which also indicate that it doesn't seem to have been in particularly high demand. So the Book of Ceremonies describes cotton being used as part of kit for soldiers, and the Book of the Eparch, linen merchants are permitted to use cotton as the interior linings of garments. So my second example is Islamic Spain, which also presents something of a problem. So according to Andalusi writers, it was a primary producer of cotton for export from the 9th century. The 10th century historian Al-Rasi reported that the area around Sevilla in particular produced cotton that was exported all over the Mediterranean regions, repeated by later writers like the 11th century geographer Al-Ujri. Cotton is also briefly mentioned in the calendar of Cordoba as being sown in March, and later agronomists refer to its cultivation throughout all of Spain. However, Andalusi cotton is not mentioned outside of Al-Andalus. It doesn't appear in the Cairo Geniza, it doesn't appear in Latin notarial contracts, or in the works of non-Andalusi writers. And as a point of comparison, we do find a discussion of Andalusi silks throughout the Mediterranean. The recent survey of archaeobotanic remains from 83 archaeological sites spanning the Roman and Islamic periods in Spain did not find any cotton or even much evidence of any agricultural change in the early Islamic period, concluding that there was more continuity with earlier periods, like the Roman period. So I think this probably means that there was limited local cultivation of cotton, but that it becomes more important in the 13th and 14th centuries, but not for export. An additional hint comes from the 12th century geographer Al-Idrisi, who wrote that in Al-Andalus, the rich wore cotton while the poor wore wool, quite the opposite of how cotton is being used elsewhere in the Mediterranean, perhaps a sign of regional patterns of production and consumption. So clearly neither data set, the text and the archaeobotany, are providing a full picture. But I think what it is showing is that cotton cultivation and use expands in some areas, expanding from pre-Islamic networks, but not in others. And it is certainly not present at significant scale throughout the Mediterranean until after the 11th or even 12th centuries, after the expansion of trade networks. So we return to the question of which is more important, the point of introduction, or when we judge it to have been having an impact on wider society. And there are problems with both of these points. We don't actually know when cotton is introduced to any of these regions, only when we have the first evidence. And we also can't as yet substantiate the scale of impact depicted in the sources either. So rather, I think this is, it's the long process in between by which local adaptation occurs and then expands. In the case of cotton, the answer is that the ultimate impact remains local throughout the first millennium, as both adoption and dissemination remain regional and through marginal landscapes. But this shouldn't be confused with a lack of significance, because it demonstrates independence of adaptation to regional needs and strategies as part of long-term processes.